joining us here in the studio in Doha is Al Jazeera senior political analyst Marwan Bishara. Let's kick off our conversation talking about Homs. Highly significant, the city has been almost obliterated. Is that a victory for the government, or is it something much, much more subtle?
It's much more subtle. It's part of this process that's presumably started in Vienna, where there has to be some sort of separation of forces, if you will, and there has to be some sort of a calming of the situation. And there is almost a certain will, if you will, on the part of both sides at this point to calm things down, especially in places where it's clear that one party has the upper hand over the other. But I think some of that might, of course, also face a dead end if we see setbacks in Riyadh and Vienna and other places. But for the time being, I think that the general mood is no one is winning in Syria. So let's at least for the time being, settle down, take it easy until we see if there's a serious transitional process possible.
Okay, the other strand to our thinking today has got to be about Iraq. So Barzani is in Ankara. The Iraqi government is trying to exert some leverage somehow over those Turkish forces on the ground around Mosul. What's the central message from Baghdad to Ankara today?
Look, it's actually quite interesting. The way I read it, Peter, is that apparently originally there was a deal where the Turks can send advisors and their equipment and so on and so forth around Mosul to train, just like they're training in two other places in Kurdistan, in Slimani and in Erbil. Now, apparently the Turks have reinforced their presence in Mosul without coordination with Baghdad. Usually you would think this would be settled in a phone call or in some kind of a, look, you've done it this way, you need to do it this other way, and so on and so forth. But the political situation is so explosive, and there are so many invisible hands playing everyone else. Like, of course, Baghdad is being influenced by Tehran and Moscow, and Turkey has been influenced by others, and it has certain interest in Iraq. So much so that a simple coordination matter is threatened to be taken to the Security Council instead of being managed locally. So there is a military component to this whole issue, but really in its essence, it's a political issue.
Okay, we've got the GCC meeting as well in Riyadh. That kicks off in, what, 2.5 hours or so. We've got the other meeting taking place in Riyadh as well, and they've got to be put in the diplomatic blender with what John Kerry announced yesterday, because there'll be another meeting in New York. How do those three things click together?
That's what you call a tour de force, right? And we've just heard today, I think, right, that before New York, there's going to be a meeting in Paris. You know, there is a real escalation, if you will, of the diplomatic process, because certainly the Americans feel that they need to rush this process forward with the Russians in order to get something done on the ground. Now, clearly, the Saudis are going to be thanked by the Gulf leaders for hosting this conference. Clearly, no news is good news from Riyadh on the issue of the Syrian opposition. It means no one is leaving. It means there is no serious misunderstanding or disagreement that is sort of making its way to the media. Now, the Gulf, of course, the Supreme Gulf Council is the first time headed by the Saudi king, King Salman. They're having some local agendas. The first time they will have VAT, they will have taxation amongst them. But really the most taxing issue is Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and so on and so forth. And these are the discussions that will go underway in Riyadh.
What's the dynamic here, the real dynamic? Because all this frenetic diplomacy that's going on in the Arab world, in the West, between the US and France and the UK and Russia, blah, 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 it doesn't feel as if the driving force here is what happened in Paris on Friday, November the 13th. Could it be that those people taking part in that have had to focus in on what's going on the ground in Syria and in the air over Syria, and it's pictures that the international news channels are not getting access to? We're not seeing the war, but people know it's happening.
Right. Of course, you know, you would start with the idea, how could it be that after 5 years and 300,000 casualties that the international community did not really act until a major explosion, a terrible one, happened in Paris, right? Of course, all that is important. But there are, as you said, Peter, no less important components. One is the Russian intervention in Syria. That really pushed, nudged the West to act in a different way in Syria. Second, I think after 5 years again and 300,000 casualties, it's clear that no one is winning in Syria. And this is only spiraling out of control, feeding into ISIL and its terrorism. And hence, I think there's a consensus now that the situation in Syria needs to be contained. The only way to do it, aside from all this bombing that's happening over Syria, is to have a serious diplomatic process. I think the French, the Americans, the Russians, and others are all convinced now that they need a diplomatic process. They're just not in agreement over what are the details of that diplomatic process.
Devil in the details.
Yes.
Marwan, many thanks.